Hi, I'm Greg Lindsay. I am the Director of Applied Research at New Cities here in Montreal. But I am a speaker, a thinker, a futurist. I work with a number of think tanks and organizations to plot a course for the future about whether that's cities, mobility, artificial intelligence, and all sort of the mechanisms that underpin daily life. I wrote a book called Aerotropolis that came out in 2011 that was critically acclaimed, that looked at the intersection of cities, globalization, and air travel in that particular case. Three things which, badly hit by the pandemic. But these days, I'm basically sort of tracking sort of, where we go from here, particularly with regards to climate change, which will be the big challenge on the far side of the pandemic, the next great human crisis. The so-called death of cities that so many predicted early in the pandemic has obviously not come to pass. And being here in North America, it strikes me as a particularly sort of American stance to have. I don't think anybody in East Asia or Europe really had that conversation. But obviously, remote work and its instant adoption has led to massive changes for cities, particularly the whole model of how, you put skyscrapers and offices in the center of cities and then ring it with services and design public transportation networks to bring people in these tidal waves in and out every day. That has changed, perhaps substantially, perhaps permanently. And obviously cities need to rethink about how people should move around, how we should relocate businesses. We've seen some cities like Paris, push forward with the so-called 15-minute city. Milan, Madrid, and others have done this as well. In the United States, we've seen lots of people simply leave high-cost coastal cities and move to sprawling Sunbelt metros, and of course, taking their housing crisis with them. We've seen, spikes in housing prices around the world. So, policymakers and businesses alike need to think a lot about the fact that whereas once you could reasonably compel people to come into an office 5 days a week and move to these high-cost cities for jobs, now there's a lot of rethinking going on about how do we want to live, where do we want to live, what kind of services do we want to be with, who do we want to be with, what kind of people, what kind of values. And that is leading to all sorts of interesting permutations, ranging from, people thinking about, the Great Resignation, which is, the waves of quitting that we've seen, again, particularly in the United States, to watching cities compete against themselves for talent. No longer are they competing for firms to move there, but literally the individual hearts and minds of workers. And, in some cities like Miami and Dubai are attracting people who want beaches and low taxes, while others like Helsinki are advertising their free public schools and other attributes. So it's a really fascinating time. Every city is going to advance its own advantages and own sort of attributes. And I'm really excited to see where the great sorting goes. I moved to Montreal. This is where I have a confession to make. I moved to Montreal in 2019, in part because of an essay that I wrote with my friend Parag Khanna. I wrote the book Move. We wrote a piece together asking, where will you live in 2050? And our answers were places that would be climate resilient and also have good governance. Well, we each sort of, put our money where our mouth is. He moved to Singapore and got the good governance, and I moved to Montreal and got the excellent climate. But it is something I thought about too. I, as an American living in New York for 20 years, and dealing with the same challenges that people woke up to during the pandemic about, do I want to continue to live this way? Or what is it I want for my life, particularly when I have children? A question being asked by so many millennials now as they enter their peak childbearing years. I chose Montreal because, Quebec is invested in a robust social safety net, a childcare model that's being adopted by the rest of Canada, obviously thinking about climate change and thinking about evolving weather patterns, but also the fact that, I could live in a lower cost, smaller city, but still have the incredible walkability and quality of life here, that it felt like, I could have the best of all possible worlds, which is exactly what any rational person is doing during the pandemic and elsewhere, about thinking through, how is it that I want to live? So I haven't learned French yet, but one of these days. COP26 was both, invigorating and disappointing at the same time. And I guess I fall sort of on the disappointing side. It's one thing for nation state governments to talk about great pledges and committing to staying to 1.5 degrees centigrade global temperature rise, but the plans are insufficient, and I think the planning is insufficient there too. I mean, simply hoping that we can mitigate our emissions and simply saying that we'll be able to adapt our cities and build seawalls and things, I think, is unrealistic. I'm interested in sort of what happens next. The toughest conversations are the ones that are still ahead of us, which is about where will people move? Climate change is already baked in. We're already seeing increasing climate disasters. We're already seeing regions that are increasingly more vulnerable. And again, particularly in a United States context, People are still moving to the most vulnerable regions in Florida, Texas, California. We're seeing financial markets try to react to this. We're seeing insurers try to basically prevent people from owning homes there by refusing to insure them. So how do we build the policies, that will encourage people to move to safer regions? How do we invest, the Green New Deal in the United States and the European Green Deal in regions that are more climate resilient? And how do we sort of steer this? People are loath to have these conversations, particularly about, given all the baggage that we take about where we live and what's home. But we know this is going to be a century of mass migration. We already know that more people are refugees than after World War II. So we need to start planning. We need to start thinking about this because we simply can't keep out everyone forever. And these are the really tough conversations that I think about will we have a new global north that is able to receive these migrants, or will we see increasingly hardened borders to try to keep them out? At some level, that's a very big, high-level policymaker move, but also, trillions of dollars are at stake in thinking about this. And we can either have an orderly transition and build new wealth and new value in cities, or we could see a massive wave of wealth destruction. How do we keep innovating in a post-pandemic world? I'm in the camp that basically argues that remote work is not the right answer when it comes to innovation, when it comes to bringing people together. As an urbanist, I am ultimately about bringing together people in public space. It's what I believe in. And it's a failure of the office that people are desperate to stay as far away from it as possible. But I do think for organizations, there's going to be a real penalty to that. I mean, we know there's all sorts of evidence here that innovation happens through all sorts of weak ties, right? Not just product teams reporting to each other, doing their work better. It's not about productivity. It's about serendipity. It's about other things. And there's challenges to this notion. But, we saw, for example, early in the pandemic, Microsoft, tracked all of its communications across 60,000 employees and saw that, that basically they were losing track of each other. They were losing those weak ties. I think all the time about the former CEO of Hewlett Packard who once said, if HP knew what HP knows, we'd be 3 times more productive. And what he meant is that they were lost track of the knowledge inside their workers' brains. They had no idea how to get it out again. And that's the kind of memory loss that we've seen in organization after organization during the pandemic. So it's going to be incumbent upon orgs to basically, provide higher pay, provide better incentives, provide better offices, create new forms of collaboration to bring their people back together. Perhaps not 5 days a week in a container for doing work, but perhaps, bring their people together with peers in other organizations and new shared workspaces, perhaps in thinking about, new types of retreats, other ways of bringing people together for that kind of relaxed, informal collaboration that goes beyond simply, hosting another meeting. Companies are going to have to push this much harder than they ever have before. They can't simply fall back on the notion that you can compel people to come to a box to sit there and do work 5 days a week. And that's something that I think that's the next space. We have to innovate how we innovate. Yes, how will blockchain, NFTs, and Web3 change how we collaborate? I'm working on this experiment right now. I partnered with a friend who built the world's second legally incorporated DAO, distributed autonomous organization. It was incorporated in the state of Vermont. And we're thinking about, how do we create, these kinds of new networks of collaboration post-pandemic? Because, organizations, companies are only really one way of organizing people. And, working 8 hours or 9 or 10 or 12 hours a day is only one way of doing work. There's completely different tempos, rhythms, collaboration patterns that we can work in. So we're creating a DAO. We're trying to basically create a network, a conspiracy, if you will, of some of the world's foremost thinkers about how and where we work. And we're going to use this distributed autonomous organization to pay them for their time and contributions in the form of these tokens, and doing so, we hope to sort of recognize, the contributions that are never captured in offices, the people who make their coworkers better, the people who have the great ideas that are never really captured, all these forms of incentives and benefits that fall outside traditional models of pay. And it'll be an interesting experiment to see about whether that kills the golden goose or whether that creates new methods of really awarding each other and recognizing each other and bringing people together in various patterns. So I guess stay tuned, but yeah, I'm really excited about thinking about, how can we actually create new software, new operating systems for organizing how people work together. When it comes to the future of artificial intelligence, I think in many ways people are asking a lot of the wrong questions. It's not about, when will the robots replace us per se, or when we'll create a human mind. I think it's about, are we creating the right kinds of AI? And by that question, I think about the fact of, that traditionally when you introduce new technologies that are labor saving, historically, it would unleash a wave of productivity. It would drive down the costs of labor in certain activities, and suddenly you'd have all of these unmet demands and services that could be met, and it would create an explosion of new jobs. And then eventually, over time, it would destroy jobs. Those would become commoditized, and you would see this cycle repeat over and over. When it comes to AI, a lot of artificial intelligence is being used not to create, new services or to enhance productivity. It's being used to suppress wages and push people down. And I think about this, are we doing the right kind of AI? And so, using robots to stock shelves and using telepresence and the metaverse to do these kinds of things, I think we're asking the wrong kinds of questions. It's about, how do we create value with this? How do we create new forms of creativity? I'm excited to have an AI as a sparring partner to helping me think more imaginatively. And, I've got a license to GPT-3, which is the great, writer, basically an artificial intelligence that will help you write and think and complete stories. Those are the kinds of innovations we need to expand our imaginations, not just simply, deploying automation for automation's sake. So, that's one way I think about it. The other way I think about it too is also, we think about self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles. I think that's the horseless carriage of AI. Really, it's going to be about autonomous things. It's going to be about how is this technology applied to the world around us? And so it won't look like a car driving down the street. It's going to look like an autonomous trash can or autonomous delivery bot or other kinds of services that don't exist today. And what does that world look like? And how is it delivered? And, and again, what are the costs? What are the opportunities? Who gains and who loses? The metaverse. I mean, if you believe Mark Zuckerberg, we're all going to spend the rest of our lives with VR headsets on and be endless meetings for him. And I don't think that's the metaverse we want. Virtual reality, of course, has been a vision for 30 plus years and thinking about cyberspace, and it hasn't come to pass. And, if it does, it's going to be a question of the hardware. Will we create either, virtual reality headsets that we put on? I doubt it. Or will we have, perhaps Apple Glass or some other form that will overlay information onto the world around us? I hope it's that, because I do believe reality is a richer experience than anything we can create in VR. But if it does, it's going to create its own kinds of challenges and opportunities as well. And we saw this 5 years ago. Pokemon Go, if you remember that phenomenon, was really sort of a wake-up call here, where suddenly, and a company has simply dropped a magical universe on top of everything we knew. And we saw crowds of people coming together in public space, or chasing virtual Pokemons through parks, or trying to pack into businesses, or tragically running out into the street where they were hit by cars. Researchers at Purdue University estimate that, that in the United States alone, hundreds of people and billions of dollars of damage might have happened because of that. So I'm interested in the metaverse about, how do we create a shared reality, or how do we create places where, we could have a Harry Potter and a Star Wars and an Avengers and entirely new ways of sharing experiences together, but also protect that public realm, and also protect, the fact that we have real world businesses. And I think this is something that real estate in particular has to grapple with, that the same technology companies that have undermined brick and mortar through e-commerce and other models are now going to come for physical space itself. So how do we think through what these new value equations should be, and how we should integrate these technologies into our life in a good additive way, and not one that takes us out of the real world? What's next for me? I'm working on a number of projects. I'm thinking hard about this metaverse. I'm trying to, round up collaborators to do a research project with cities to think about how do we prepare for that inevitable day to come. I'm thinking a lot about, the so-called ghost kitchens and dark stores, what I call dark city, which is, the rise of these billion-dollar delivery giants that are, eliminating storefronts in global cities. What challenges do they pose to traditional retailers and businesses? Thinking through about, what the post-pandemic city looks like, of course. Traditionally mixed-use development, for example, was, you took some offices and you put services and housing around it. Well, what happens now when the best use of public space is for people to be together? And we're seeing developers, create food and entertainment and dining at their core, and then bringing that with services. So I'm tracking sort of all these threads, trying to understand, again, sort of how technology, human desire, fears of the pandemic all come together to imagine new ways of living and being together.